Hello, I'm Len Clark of Irish 101, and today a special treat for you, an interview with an individual who is known as a family man, a Notre Dame man, a member of the 1966 National Championship football team as an honorary member, and an author, my friend Mark Hubbard. Mark, it is great to see you and to talk about your new book, Ara.
Well, thank you for having me. I really enjoy being with you, and you've been a good friend all these years.
Mark, you have been tasked with the undaunting task of documenting the life of Ara Parseghian. And the first question that really came to my mind, that's a lot of responsibilities, especially with the connection you have to his family that you did with Ara and members of his teams over the years. What was that like?
Well, when I started this project, and I'll tell you how it started in a minute, Rocky Blyer sent me an email. He said, Mark, you've taken on a monumental task. And he was right. It took almost 5 years to get it from start to finish. But it began, very innocently in a sense. I was just a 17-year-old kid coming to campus in 1967. And Ara was, it was a major figure in American sports by then. And we were all in awe of him. So I'm a very unlikely guy to have been selected by the gods to write this book. But it came about because my brother and I wrote a book many years ago called Forgotten Four about the 1953 team that had four first-round draft picks. It was Leahy's last year. And that book went well. And Joe Doyle, who was the retired sports editor of the South Bend Tribune, called me and said, Mark, I want you to write the book about the 1966 national champions. A book had come out called I'm trying to think of it now, but the book of Jim Dent, Resurrection, about the 64 season. And Joe thought that I was the guy that should write the book about the 66 season. So he drove me out to meet the coach, which was the first time I met him in person. And we sat down, and that's how it all started. Ara really liked the way I approached the 66 book, debunking the myth that he played for a tie. And we became fast friends after that. And I was always warmly welcomed at his home. And so when the time came after his passing for Katie to figure out who she would like to have write a biography, she called me and she said, I want you to do it, meaning me, because you knew him and you were friends. And I think you're going to do a good job. So that was the start of it. And I was honored and humbled, and it's been a labor of love for all of us involved. I will tell you and anybody listening that I'm not taking any author royalties from this book. I'm going to donate it all to the Parseghian Medical Research Foundation. And so the journey has been one that now I'm getting to enjoy doing interviews with people like you and tell the story of Ara and his life.
What was it like meeting Ara for the first time?
It was scary, I'll tell you, because he, in some ways, as a student, he was unapproachable. Nobody ever really met him. You just saw him on the sidelines when you were a student. And of course, I never ran into him informally until I went out with Joe Doyle. And when we sat down to do the interview, I was a little timid. And Ara, I think, was slightly put off because he probably did this as a favor to Joe to get the book started. And so his first question to me, which kind of told me where his mindset was, he said, so I suppose you want to know about the 1966 tie at Michigan State. But he did it with a little bit of an edge to his voice. And I paused and I said, no, Coach, I'd like you to tell me about this picture. And I handed him the photo of his 1941 Akron South football team. And in it were all 11 players, 7 in front, 4 in the backfield. And standing right next to Ara was an African-American player. And I never even had to ask him a question about that photo. He paused, he looked at it, and he looked up, he said, That's our tailback, Conwell Findlay. I wonder whatever happened to him. And from that moment on, I think he thought that I would write a different kind of book. And he was very pleased with the outcome. And so we became friends, and it started in a very funny moment at his office. And I'm happy for that story.
To use a quote from Ara, when he became head coach at Notre Dame, he said he needed every year of experience of his previous coaching stops dating back to Miami of Ohio and Northwestern. You had an opportunity to write two books prior to this, probably more. What did you learn from writing those books that helped you, as I once again will say, this daunting task
Mm.
to write the biography of probably one of the best coaches in Notre Dame history?
Well, the first book I wrote with my brother, Donald Hubbard, and I did the background research, the photographs, the covers, and so forth, but I really didn't do any of the text, so to speak. It was a joint project. But in the process there, I had access to a lot of the players because I knew them from my former life as a marketing director at the first College Football Hall of Fame in Cincinnati. And so I would contact the people, and then we would interview them, and my brother Donald would write the book. And writing looked very hard to me. So when Joe came and said, I'd like you to write the book about the 66 national championship, which is titled Undisputed, I thought, my God, I've never really written a complete book start to finish. And so writing is actually difficult. People that think they're going to go out and just knock out a book. I was trained in architecture. I wasn't an English major, and I didn't have to do very much writing. So the writing was difficult in the sense that I didn't use good spelling or punctuation. But I had learned over the years from my work in broadcasting and others to try to tell a story. So I started with storytelling as a way to tell that season's story. And then, of course, when I got to the biography, it was very different because you're looking at the entirety of a man's life from birth to passing, and you want to get it right. And so I had to start with a game plan. And the game plan that I eventually decided on was this was going to be a book about personality and character. Obviously, football was going to be a big part of it because that was a big part of his life. But Ara was a guy that lived a full life, and his whole story needed to be told. Luckily, along the way, Ara left a lot of materials behind for me to use from his files. Katie his wife was marvelous. She gave me complete access to all of their materials. Plus, I have over 30 hours of Katie and I on tape. So she was very open in the entire process. So I had good base materials to work with. And then what I decided to do is think of it as a picture puzzle, that I would write the outline first, and then I would move toward filling in all the puzzles in the middle. And I think I got a lot of the puzzle pieces into the picture as relating to personality and character. I apologize to my friends in the football world if their name isn't in the book or I forgot a good story or an anecdote. But I had to be very selective in what I could put in the book that would meet the publisher's criteria.
And this took 5 years.
It took 5 years. Of course, we were interrupted by COVID, which made it difficult for Katie and I to communicate. And then I spent one of those years largely in and out of hospitals fighting kidney cancer, which is, I'm now cancer free, I'm happy to say. But
Congrats.
that was kind of the lost year. But it was a 5-year project. I was just talking to a friend of mine who has written one of the most important sports books in history. His name is Buzz Bissinger. He wrote Friday Night Lights. And Buzz asked me, he said, how long did it take you to write this biography? I said, well, almost 5 years. He said, that's pretty good. He said, when I wrote Friday Night Lights, it took me 14 years. So writing is a process. It's not, you don't sit down at the keyboard and become just wonderful at it. You have to really work at it.
We're talking with author Mark Hubbard of the new book, Ara, the definitive biography of the great Notre Dame coach. You mentioned writing, another quote from another famous Notre Dame graduate, Red Smith, who said, writing, how do you write? you open up a vein and you bleed. I imagine you bled a lot writing this book.
Well, it's very funny. I didn't bleed, but the equivalent for me is because of my kidney situation. I almost always wake up at about 3 a.m. in the morning, having to visit the boys' room here. And when you have to go back to sleep, your mind wanders, and oftentimes your brain takes over on unfinished business. And I can't tell you how many nights I would be awake after 3 a.m. trying to figure out a way to tell a story or a way to phrase an incident to make this book be as good as possible. So, in a certain sense, I had a corollary, yes, that I got a number of sleepless nights trying to do this, and I would write notes in the middle of the night trying to figure out how to say a certain way or to put the a story in perspective. And so, I had to include things that you would think, well, normally you wouldn't include, but I had to include something about the war in Vietnam because it was a big part of Ara's time in coaching. And I had to include something about civil rights and race relations because there was major changes during Ara's tenure as a coach in those areas. And so I had to weave those in carefully. And I think I did a pretty good job because I don't just slap you over the face. I try to tell a story. In the case of race relations, we delve into the history of Conwell Finley and then what happened in Ara through his life with regard to race relations. And then with the war in Vietnam, I borrowed a lot of I guess really I would consider personal engagement with Rocky Bleier, who of course had the story that that really makes him such a hero in most people's minds about being one of the few athletes drafted during the Vietnam War and then being injured and then working his way back and having 4 Super Bowl rings. I mean, Rocky has been a wonderful friend, and he wrote the most marvelous foreword to this book, which I'm going to quote every time I go out and make a book presentation. It's just great.
Mark, what was the biggest thing that you learned about Ara writing the book?
Well, it's funny. You think of people as being invincible, and the thing about Ara, he was very, very introspective. He knew the things he wanted to accomplish, and he was very dedicated to those. But learning the decision for him to leave college coaching, a lot of people had questions about that. And when you read his files and letters he sent to Father Hesburgh or Father Joyce, and I had access to some of the medical records with his physician, you realize that he knew he was burned out and that it was time for him to make a change for the benefit of his own health and that of his family and and all of the people around him. That took courage. It's a kind of courage you don't really talk about much, but I think that self evaluation and making a major decision, it would be so easy to stay, kind of in the limelight and be a hero and be sought after by everybody and everybody wants your autograph. It took a lot of courage to walk away from college football. And I think that was one of the things that I learned in writing this book that took a lot of courage.
Ara has been defined as a leader. Are leaders made or are they born? In the case of Ara, was he born for destiny or what created him? What created Ara?
Well, his background is fascinating because he was born of immigrant parents. Everybody thinks of him as an Armenian Presbyterian. In truth, he was at least half French Catholic, which we reveal in the book. His upbringing as a kid during the Depression, I think, made a big impression. He was always gifted in athletics, and there was never any evidence that he was really a gifted student in the school sense, but he was a very smart guy. So he probably was very good in school as well. I think the time that he spent in the Navy was really important to him, that was a growth experience. Of course, he got to meet and play football for Paul Brown, which was a big influence in his life, being at Great Lakes Naval Training Station. And then, he came back. he started again in college. He had done 1 year at the University of Akron, went to Miami University because he visited his cousin while he was in the Navy, really liked the campus, decided that's where he wanted to go. And, lo and behold, it changed his life. He did well at Miami. He met Katie at Miami. Ultimately, he was hired by Woody Hayes to be a freshman coach at Miami after he was injured playing for the Browns. And Miami was a big part of his life. And so you look for inflection points in people's life that you wonder if would they be the same person without this thing happening or that thing happen. The one that is kind of interesting is that his mother wouldn't let him play football in high school. His brother forged her signature, and he joined the team when he was a junior at Akron South, and his mother only knew about it when she saw his picture in the newspaper. But imagine if his mother said, "You have to quit the team." Where would we be today? I mean, that was a major inflection point thanks to his brother forging his signature. These kinds of things are like gold when you trip on them when you're writing a biography.
Ara, of course, the leader of the Notre Dame program from 1964 to 1975, but he had some right-hand people like Tom Pagna. And I had the opportunity to talk to Tom Pagna many times, and I've never talked to a person who talked about another person with such reverence and how much of an impact that one individual has on another. And I imagine Ara touched thousands of people.
Oh, thousands and thousands, really. I run into people every day, especially here in South Bend, that met him or knew him or whatever. But Pagna had a really special relationship. And I was very fortunate because when I needed to write more about the final couple of years of Ara's life, especially the bowl games, I had the ability to use the reference that Tom Pagna and Bob Best wrote in Era of Ara. And so I was able to draw from that book a lot that I included in my book to kind of typify what was really going on at the end of Ara's career. But you're right, they were very close. Pagna was on Ara's team in Miami, and they stayed close throughout their lives. And Tom was really a genius in his own right. If you spent any time with him, and I was fortunate to do it, he could dissect a football game even in retirement as well as anybody out there. He was really a brilliant guy.
The book is called Ara, the author Mark Hubbard. You can get it at the Notre Dame bookstore. I believe you've got a number of signings throughout the football season, and
Oh yeah, no,
they
I've
can get
just
it on the Amazon and the other places online as well.
Amazon, Barnes and Noble. I'm delighted to sign them and to meet the public and tell the story of an amazing individual. And I think if you were to look up the recent review in the Wall Street Journal, I think it was very well done because they focus on the idea that it's about personality and what an amazing person Ara was. And for that, I'm really very pleased because I think I did a good job.
When you take a look at Notre Dame football, the icons of Rockne, Leahy, and Parseghian, what did Ara bring to the culture of Notre Dame, to the football program that will live forever now?
Well, when Ara got here and started in '64, he was hired in '63. We had a number of years that were disappointing, and those years were referenced as the period of penance. And I think if Father Hesburgh and Father Joyce hadn't hired Ara and he was a perfect fit for Notre Dame, we may not be in the same spot we are today. If you look at so much of what he brought, starting in the first year of a national championship run and shared a national championship in 1964, it's just pretty amazing. I mean, he brought a whole new culture. He brought people's hope back. He brought their pride back. Notre Dame has always been a school that had one of the brand issues was football, and he brought that back. And if you look around today, I don't think a lot of what we see today that's part of the ongoing culture would even be possible if we hadn't had those 11 wonderful years of Ara. He really, as Father Hesburgh said, Ara changed everything. He made the entire difference.
I met Ara in 1971. He was recruiting my cousin, who eventually turned down Notre Dame to go to Missouri. And ironically, my first Notre Dame football game was in 1972 when Missouri beat Notre Dame 30-26 in a rainstorm here at Notre Dame Stadium. But I had a chance to meet my hero. And somebody asked me one time, how did you know you were grown up? And I said, when my heroes became human. But Ara always rose above. He seemed immortal to me, but he was human. He dealt
Oh,
with a lot of tragedies, Niemann-Pick
yeah,
type C.
yeah.
In your research and talking to the family, how did Ara handle all of that? How did he handle burying grandchildren?
Well, I tell the story in the book because he retired from football, coaching football, when he was 51, and he lived until he was 94. That's a lot of years to fill with doing other things. Of course, he became a very respected broadcaster, working with Keith Jackson at ABC and then with Brett Musburger at CBS. But I think if you asked him what the thing that he would like to be remembered for was the dedication he spent raising money for medical research, both for his daughter, who eventually succumbed from multiple sclerosis, and then his three grandchildren, who, as you referenced, were stricken with Niemann-Pick type C. He really dedicated his life from about from the time he was 75 till he died to raising funds for medical research. And and I think the legacy that he would be most proud of would be that legacy. Obviously, he was proud of all the things he did in football and in life and in business, and being a good dad, a good husband. All those things were important. Um, but he never really wanted a biography written about himself. I'm glad I was able to do this. How he dealt with Niemann-Pick type C, God, I don't know. And knowing that your three grandchildren were going to eventually, not make it. Um, there's a part in the book where he was quoted in a newspaper article, and somebody asked him, "Do you pray?" He said, "Yes, I pray." He said, "But I've decided that prayer isn't enough. If you do something beyond prayer, then you're adding to the ability to answer those prayers." And so that was a very poignant part of the book. Well, the person that edited the book thought that was the best sentence in the entire book, and I'm going to use it in my presentations when I do them to the public.
Mark, when an individual gets the book, we live in a society where we tend to binge watch television shows or what have you. I'm the kind of person that would just want to digest this thing as quick as possible. How should people approach the book and read the book?
Well, it's interesting. I think once you get into it, you're kind of drawn in. There are 30 chapters, and I wrote every chapter so that it's a mini story arc, so that you can actually read one chapter at a time and bounce around and find the things you want to read about, because you'll see kind of a complete story from start to finish evolve. I mean, there's stories about humor. There's stories about his golf. There's stories about some of the great games. But obviously, his early days, most people don't know about that. So I tried to do it so that you could actually read it and digest it in chapters. It's not one of those things you have to read from start to finish for it to make sense. But I think the way I'm hearing people read it is once they dive into it and they find the things that they think they want to read about, then they go back and they read the entire thing. So I hope the entirety of his life is really exposed, because he lived, as they said in the Wall Street Journal, an extraordinary life, and it was my job to capture that. I think I did a good job. I had a lot of help with Katie and others that knew him, and I think the story is Ara's story. It's not my story.
What do you hope people will take away from the book? What do you want them to know about Ara?
Well, what a fine individual he was. And I mean, high character, high intelligence, very engaged with people, and very, very smart. I mean, we would wander into subjects well beyond football, and he had a depth of knowledge in current events and in politics and things going on in South Bend. I mean, he was really a person that had an enormous capacity to process information, and of course, he had to do a lot of that on the sideline when he was a coach. But I think the thing that really would get me would be, his son-in-law, Jim Humbert, who lives in South Bend, said he thought that the word that described Ara was integrity. And I think that's a good way to think of Ara, as a person of really high integrity. And then, of course, Ara's daughter, Chris, added to it. She said, my father always did the right thing. If somebody can say that about their father, that's an amazing thing to be able to say about a parent. And I have read so much about Ara, and a lot of it is not even true. But I will tell you, from what I know and what I experienced myself, Ara was one of those special people, and I think he always did the right thing.
Ara certainly blazed a trail. Is there anybody out there in college football that has some of the traits that embodies the spirit of Ara Parseghian?
Well, you have to look at Nick Saban and say, what a successful coach. And I think, he has a lot of the characteristics. He learned coaching over time, and he became a really, really good coach, I think, at Alabama. And the thing that I respect, it's an odd thing to say, but is that he left coaching when he knew that coaching was not going to be the same, and he wanted to leave it on his terms. And I think that's the thing that I think Ara did as well. He left coaching on his terms. So I think he was good, but Ara had some wonderful role models as well. I mean, he had great friends in coaching. George Allen was a very good friend of his who coached for the Redskins, and he knew a lot of the coaches out there very, very well. He had, you think about it, his coaching tenure spanned from Paul Brown all the way through Urban Meyer, who wrote a very nice letter when Ara was in the hospital. I wasn't able to include it because I couldn't get permission fast enough to do it. But think about the span of people that he influenced, and everybody says the same thing, that he was a model coach and a model person.
Mark, a final question. What is in the water in Ohio that produces great football, Ben?
I don't think it's in the water. I think Miami has an advantage that I speak about in the book, and that is it's in the Mid-America Conference, and you can become a coach at Miami, and you have some room to fail a little bit without being fired. I drew the comparison between Terry Brennan and Ara in the book. They were both about the same age. Terry got the job at Notre Dame at age 27. Ara got the job at Miami at about the same time. But Ara was able to learn coaching over time. And Terry, who I have enormous respect for, was thrown into basically the hardest job in college football right away. And I think he never really was able to catch up with the demands of the job. And so I think Miami is a great place to go to learn coaching. And if you're a good student, you learn it faster. And so that's probably the magic of Miami University.
The book is out now. It is called Ara. All sales are going to help the Niemann-Pick Type C Foundation. Mark Hubbard, a loyal son of Notre Dame, is the author. Mark, thank you so much for sharing.
It's my pleasure. Go Irish.